The wind howled through the empty park, its cold breath rustling the leaves on the old oak tree. Underneath, a little boy crouched behind the thick bushes, his tiny body trembling, his heart pounding so loudly he thought they might hear him. His mother always warned him not to play too close to the bridge. But curiosity had led him here, to the spot where he could watch the river rush below. He had never imagined he'd see a man's life end. His hands clamped over his mouth, trying to stifle his gasps. He could barely see through the dense branches, but the moonlight illuminated just enough. An old man stood at the edge of the bridge, his frail body swaying slightly as he pleaded. The boy didn't understand all the words, but he knew the man was scared. His voice cracked, desperate. "No, please. I don't have it. I gave you everything, please." Another man, younger and much bigger, stood over him, his face twisted with anger. His hands were clenched into fists, shaking with rage. He took a step closer, backing the old man against the railing. "You think I'm stupid?" he growled, his voice cold as ice. "You think you can cheat me?" The old man's knees buckled. He clung to the metal rail, his knuckles white. "I didn't. I swear, please." The boy's heart raced. He wanted to run, to scream for help. But his body wouldn't move. He was frozen, trapped by fear. The bigger man grabbed the old man by his collar, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. His voice was a low, menacing whisper. "You should have stayed quiet, old man. You should have stayed out of my way." Then, without warning, he pushed. The old man's scream echoed through the night, a haunting cry that seemed to hang in the air long after his body disappeared into the darkness below. The boy's breath hitched, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were glued to the spot where the man had just stood. Gone. Just like that. The younger man looked around, his eyes scanning the empty park. The boy shrank deeper into the bushes, willing himself to become invisible. The man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. He never looked back. He never knew a little boy was watching. And the boy, he would never forget. The sun was setting over the quiet neighborhood, its golden rays painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The street was lined with tall, ancient trees, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was the kind of place where people waved to their neighbors and children played without a care. At the end of this street, in a grand but aging mansion, lived Mr. Harold Thompson, the elderly millionaire. He was a man of contradictions, wealthy beyond imagination but living alone in a house that echoed with memories of a past long gone. His wife had passed away a decade ago, and his children, consumed by their own lives, rarely visited. Yet, despite his loneliness, Mr. Thompson was known for his kindness. Every year, he donated generously to the local orphanage and funded scholarships for underprivileged children. He was respected, even loved by those who knew him. But few truly understood the pain hidden behind his gentle smile. Across town, in a small, cluttered apartment, Mark Lawson sat hunched over his desk, bills scattered before him. His face was hard, worn by years of struggle. Once a successful businessman, Mark had lost everything: his company, his house, his family. All gone, reduced to nothing but memories and resentment. His eyes flicked to the eviction notice pinned to the wall, mocking him, reminding him of his failures. Rage boiled within him, a bitterness that had grown with every missed opportunity and every door slammed in his face. He needed money, fast. And he knew exactly where to get it. His gaze shifted to an old photograph on his desk, a picture of him and Mr. Thompson, shaking hands at a charity event. Back then, they were friends. Back when Mark was still somebody. but the friendship had soured over the years, turned toxic by jealousy and desperation. Mark's fist clenched around the letter demanding repayment of a loan given by none other than Harold Thompson. A loan he could never repay. All that money, Mark muttered, his voice dripping with envy. And he just sits on it, doing nothing. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, a young boy named Tommy kicked a worn soccer ball around his backyard. 8 years old, with a wild imagination and a heart full of curiosity, Tommy was known for exploring places he shouldn't. His mother often scolded him for wandering off, but nothing could tame his adventurous spirit. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tommy heard his mother calling him in for dinner. But the call of adventure was stronger. His eyes drifted to the bridge by the park, a place he was strictly forbidden to go. But tonight, curiosity won. With one last glance at his house, Tommy ran towards the bridge, his small feet barely making a sound on the pavement. He didn't know that his innocent curiosity was about to lead him to the most terrifying night of his life. As the shadows grew longer and the air grew colder, 3 lives were set on a collision course: the kind-hearted millionaire, the desperate man, and the boy who would see everything. The night was eerily silent. A cold breeze swept across the bridge, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down Tommy's spine. He crouched behind the thick bushes, his eyes barely peeking through the branches. He could see the 2 men standing by the railing, their figures silhouetted against the pale moonlight. His heart raced as he tried to steady his breathing. He didn't understand why they were there, but the way they stood, tense, faces drawn in anger, told him something was wrong. Very wrong. Mr. Harold Thompson stood at the edge of the bridge, his frail body swaying as he clung to the cold metal railing. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked smaller than Tommy remembered, weaker, as if the man who once smiled warmly at the neighborhood kids had been replaced by a frightened old man. Facing him was Mark Lawson, his broad shoulders hunched, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. There was a darkness in his eyes, a rage that made him look almost unrecognizable. "You think I'm stupid, don't you?" Mark's voice was cold, steady, each word dripping with venom. "You think you can take everything from me and walk away like nothing happened?" Harold's voice trembled, barely a whisper. I never meant." "Mark, please, we were friends once." Mark's face twisted with contempt. "Friends? Friends don't betray each other. Friends don't leave each other to rot." His voice rose, echoing through the night. Tommy's heart pounded. He wanted to close his eyes, to cover his ears, but he couldn't look away. He was trapped, frozen by fear and curiosity. "I gave you everything," Harold pleaded, his voice breaking. "The loan, the money. I tried to help you." "Help?" Mark's laugh was bitter, cruel. "You ruined me. Your help destroyed my life." He stepped closer, his body towering over the trembling old man. "I lost my business, my house, my family. All because of you." Harold shook his head desperately. "It wasn't my fault, the market crashed. I lost money too. But you had more to lose, didn't you?" Mark's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You could afford to lose. I couldn't." His eyes were cold, unforgiving. "And now, you're going to pay." Tommy's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, to run for help, but his voice was gone, trapped in his throat. Mark grabbed Harold by his collar, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. Harold's eyes widened in horror as his hands clutched at Mark's arms, desperately trying to free himself. "Please, don't. I'll give you money, as much as you need, just let me go." Harold's voice was weak, broken. Mark's grip tightened. "You think money can fix this? You think it can bring back my wife? My daughter?" His face twisted with pain and anger. "You took everything from me, now it's your turn." Without warning, Mark shoved Harold towards the railing. The old man's back hit the metal with a sickening thud, his body teetering on the edge. He tried to regain his balance, his arms flailing, but Mark was relentless. His hands pressed against Harold's chest, his face cold, merciless. "Goodbye, old man." With one final push, Mark sent Harold over the edge. Tommy's eyes widened in horror as he watched the old man's body plummet into the darkness below. The scream that escaped Harold's lips was haunting, echoing through the night until it was swallowed by the rushing water. For a moment, everything was still. The wind whispered through the trees, and the moon watched silently as if mourning the loss. Mark stood there, his chest heaving, his fists trembling. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had just taken a man's life. His expression was blank, his eyes hollow. Slowly, he turned and looked around, his gaze sweeping across the park. Tommy held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. If Mark saw him, if Mark knew. But Mark didn't see him. Satisfied that no one was around, he took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and walked away. His footsteps echoed on the bridge, fading into the distance. He never looked back. The night swallowed him, just as it had swallowed Harold. Tommy remained motionless, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his cheeks, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He had just witnessed something terrible, something he didn't fully understand but knew was horribly wrong. And as the cold wind howled through the empty park, Tommy realized one thing: he could never tell anyone. Because if he did, that man might come back for him. The sun rose over the neighborhood, its golden light chasing away the shadows of the night before. But for Tommy, the darkness remained. He sat on his bed, his small body curled up, his face buried in his knees. He hadn't slept, not even for a moment. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see it all over again: the man's angry face, the old man's pleading eyes, and the horrible, endless fall. His hands were still shaking. He had tried to tell himself it was just a nightmare, that it wasn't real. But the images wouldn't go away, and the voice echoed in his head. "Goodbye, old man." Tommy's stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He had watched a man die. And the one who did it was still out there. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't tell his mom, she would be so angry if she knew he went to the bridge. She had warned him so many times. And if he told her what he saw, what if that man found out? What if he came for him too? Tommy's chest tightened, panic gripping him. He was just a kid. What could he do? Who would believe him? Downstairs, his mother's voice echoed up the stairs. "Tommy, breakfast is ready." He flinched at the sound, his heart skipping a beat. Everything felt wrong, out of place. How could the world keep going like nothing happened? How could his mom smile and make pancakes when a man was dead? Tommy forced himself to his feet, his legs wobbling as he made his way downstairs. His mom was at the stove, humming a tune as she flipped the pancakes. She looked so happy, so normal. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her smile warm. "Did you sleep well?" Tommy's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell her everything. But the words wouldn't come out. His eyes dropped to his feet. "Yeah, I slept fine." His mom didn't notice the tremor in his voice. She set a plate of pancakes in front of him, the smell of syrup sweet and comforting. But Tommy couldn't eat. He could still hear the scream, still see the man's body falling. He pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. "I'm not hungry." His mom's face softened with concern. "Are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." Tommy's heart raced. He wanted to tell her, to cry in her arms and beg her to make the nightmares go away. But then he remembered the man's cold eyes, the way he looked around, searching for witnesses. If he found out Tommy saw? Fear gripped him again, and he shook his head quickly. "I'm fine, Mom. Just not hungry." She frowned, but didn't push him. "All right, but if you're feeling sick, let me know, okay?" Tommy nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't let her see the fear in his eyes. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, the world around him a blur. At school, his friends laughed and played, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. His teacher's words sounded distant, muffled, as if he was underwater. All he could see was the bridge. All he could hear was the scream. When school ended, Tommy walked home slowly, his feet dragging on the pavement. The sun was shining, birds were singing, but everything felt cold. As he turned the corner, he saw them, 2 policemen standing outside Mr. Thompson's mansion, their faces grim. A small crowd had gathered, whispering in hushed tones. Tommy's heart raced as he watched them put up yellow tape around the house. He heard one of the neighbors whisper, "They found his body this morning, by the river." Another voice chimed in, "They say he must have fallen off the bridge, poor old man." Tommy's stomach dropped. He felt like he was going to be sick. They thought it was an accident. They didn't know the truth. His eyes darted to the crowd, and his heart stopped when he saw him, Mark Lawson, standing among the neighbors, his face expressionless. He was watching the police, his hands in his pockets, calm as if nothing had happened. Tommy's blood ran cold. How could he stand there so calmly? How could he pretend nothing was wrong? And then Mark looked his way. Just for a second. His eyes met Tommy's, and a chill ran down the boy's spine. Did he know? Did he see the fear in his face? Tommy quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled backward, almost tripping as he ran home. He slammed the door behind him, locking it, his chest heaving. The man who killed Mr. Thompson was free, walking around like nothing happened. And he had seen Tommy. Tommy collapsed on the floor, his body shaking. He wanted to tell someone, to make it all go away. But who would believe him? He was just a kid. And if he spoke up, that man might come for him too. He hugged his knees to his chest, tears streaming down his face. He was trapped. Alone. And he was too scared to do anything about it. The truth was suffocating him, but the fear of speaking out was even worse. He knew what he saw. But he couldn't tell a soul. Because secrets were safer than the truth. Days passed, but the haunting images didn't leave Tommy. Every night, he lay in his bed, eyes wide open, afraid to close them. The darkness seemed to whisper to him, replaying the terrible scene over and over again. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and his mom was getting worried. "What's wrong, Tommy?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "You've been so quiet lately. Are you feeling sick?" Tommy shook his head quickly, his eyes downcast. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." But even as he said it, his voice trembled. His mom's eyes softened, and she pulled him into a hug. "You know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what it is." Tommy felt a lump in his throat, his chest tightening. He wanted to tell her, to cry and let it all out. But every time he tried, the memory of the man's cold eyes stopped him. If he spoke up, the man might come for him. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he buried his face in his mom's shoulder, saying nothing. But the weight of the secret was too heavy. It was eating him alive, tearing him apart from the inside. He could feel it every time he looked at the bridge, every time he heard the whispering winds. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, he heard voices behind him. It was his classmates, talking about Mr. Thompson's death. "They say he fell off the bridge," one of them whispered. "Must have been an accident." Tommy's chest tightened. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. But no one knew. No one except him. He walked faster, his heart pounding. He had to get away, had to escape the words that haunted him. But as he turned the corner, he ran straight into someone. Strong hands gripped his shoulders, steadying him. Tommy looked up and his blood ran cold. It was Mark Lawson. Mark's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the boy, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there, Tommy. You look a little jumpy. Everything all right?" Tommy's heart raced, his body trembling. Did he know? Did he realize Tommy had seen everything? Mark's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Tommy's shoulders. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid." His voice was low, threatening. "You wouldn't be hiding something from me, would you?" Tommy's throat went dry. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His legs felt like jelly, and his body was frozen in place. Mark's smile faded, his eyes darkening. "Because you know, secrets have a way of coming out. And people who know too much don't stay safe for long." Tommy's eyes widened in fear, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He knew. Mark knew that he saw. Mark leaned in closer, his face inches from Tommy's. "If I were you, I'd keep my mouth shut. Understand?" Tommy nodded, his body trembling uncontrollably. He felt tears prick at his eyes, but he didn't dare let them fall. Not in front of him. Mark's grip loosened, and he straightened, his smile returning. "Good boy. Now run along home." Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The fear was too great. When he reached his house, he slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. His chest heaved, his heart racing. He slid down to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He was trapped. Mark knew, and now he was in danger. He hugged his knees to his chest, his body shaking. He wanted to tell his mom, to ask for help. But Mark's words echoed in his head, threatening him, warning him. If he spoke up, he wouldn't be safe. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. Every shadow looked like Mark, every sound like footsteps coming for him. He was trapped, alone, with no way out. The next morning, his mom found him curled up by the door, his face pale, his eyes red from crying. She knelt beside him, her heart breaking. "Tommy, please, talk to me. What's wrong?" Tommy looked up at her, his eyes wide and fearful. He couldn't lie anymore. He couldn't carry the secret alone. It was too heavy, too terrifying. With a trembling voice, he whispered, I saw him, the man who killed Mr. Thompson. I saw everything." His mom's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. What are you saying?" Tommy broke down, the tears he'd been holding back finally escaping. "I was there, at the bridge. I saw him push Mr. Thompson. I saw him fall, and he knows I saw." His mom's arms wrapped around him, holding him tight as his body shook with sobs. She stroked his hair, her heart breaking as she realized the weight her little boy had been carrying. "It's okay, Tommy," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "You're safe now. I promise. We're going to the police, and we're going to make sure he never hurts you." Tommy clung to her, his fears slowly giving way to relief. He wasn't alone anymore. He didn't have to keep the secret by himself. And for the first time since that terrible night, he felt just a little bit safer. But as his mom picked up the phone to call the police, Tommy's heart skipped a beat. Mark would know. And he would be furious. The nightmare wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Tommy sat in the witness stand, his small hands gripping the edge tightly, his legs swinging nervously. His heart was pounding, his mouth dry, but he was ready. His mom was in the front row, her eyes filled with worry and pride. She gave him a reassuring nod, her face softening as she mouthed the words, "You can do this." Tommy took a deep breath, his eyes shifting to the man sitting at the defendant's table. Mark Lawson stared back at him, his face cold, his eyes piercing. A shiver ran down Tommy's spine, but he didn't look away. Not this time. He had been afraid for too long. It was time to tell the truth. The prosecutor approached, his voice gentle but firm. "Tommy, can you tell us what you saw that night at the bridge?" Tommy's throat tightened, his chest heavy. But he remembered his mom's words, the truth would set him free. He looked at the jury, their faces watching him with expectation, and then he began. I was playing near the bridge. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I went there anyway." His voice was trembling, but he continued. "I saw Mr. Thompson, and him." He pointed at Mark, his finger steady. They were arguing. Mr. Thompson was scared, he was begging him to stop. The courtroom was so silent, Tommy could hear his own heartbeat. Mark's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table, but he said nothing. Tommy continued, his voice stronger now. He grabbed Mr. Thompson and pushed him off the bridge. Tears filled his eyes as he remembered the scream, the fall. He killed him, and then he walked away, like nothing happened. Gasps echoed through the room. The jurors exchanged looks, their faces pale. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the witness has identified the defendant as the murderer." Mark shot to his feet, his face twisted with anger. "You little liar," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "You didn't see anything." Tommy flinched, his body tensing. But then he looked at his mom, saw the pride in her eyes, and found his courage. "I saw you," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I saw everything." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court." Mark was pulled back into his seat by the guards, his face contorted with rage. But it was over. The truth was out. The trial ended quickly. The jury returned with a verdict of guilty, and Mark Lawson was sentenced to life in prison. Justice was served. As they left the courthouse, Tommy's mom knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Tommy. You were so brave." Tommy hugged her back, his heart finally at peace. The fear was gone, the nightmares over. He had faced the darkness and told the truth. He had been scared, but he did the right thing. And now, Mr. Thompson could finally rest in peace. As they walked away, hand in hand, Tommy looked up at the sky. The sun was shining, the darkness gone. For the first time in days, he smiled. The truth had set him free.